Hello, I'm Andre J, and welcome to another episode of Video Feedback Techniques. So today, I know it's been a while. Yeah, I've been busy with stuff. But not just that I was busy with stuff, but I was also trying to think about. I feel like I've gone over a lot of the basic stuff that you can do with like really simple setups. And I'm sort of trying to think about how I wanted to proceed. I'm trying to make these episodes not be like super like gear fetishy, like buy things, buy gear, buy whatever. But then the other side of it is that the more complex things are multi-mixer setups and using extra things and like colorizers and whatnot. So yeah, that'll be just sort of an ongoing thing. I think the next episode I do will focus on different classes of mixers that can do 3D rotational things and talk about that sort of world, about sort of getting past like straight up SD mixer worlds, because yeah, crazier mixers from the noughts right up to the end of the SD era, mid-noughts or whatever, are coming on the market now, and they're options for people out there, and I'm sort of studying them and trying to learn about what I can use from that to put into my video mixer project. But yeah, so I don't know, but also please feel free to comment on these things and let me know what kind of things you would like to see covered. Other things I could think about would just be like using two mixers, doing internal feedback back and forth, and really just kind of focusing on like just the internal feedback kind of things. But either way, what we have for today is we're going to talk about what you can do to video feedback outside of the video chain but still using it in like a live setting. So I'm talking about post-processing here, but what I mean by post-processing isn't that we save the file and work on it in like an Adobe thing or whatever. What I mean by post-processing is that we've got a camera pointed at a screen and there's the feedback chain right there, and then we're going to do something with the like out from that chain. So instead of putting effects and whatnot inside of the chain, which is what we focused on a lot, we're going to talk about what you can do with effects outside of the chain, because there's some things that just don't really work with the feedback. Certain effects, certain styles are just going to make things kind of like strobe or go into noise or just get too busy or just kill it entirely. But then when you apply them to feedback outside of the chain, it works really, really well. And one of those things we're going to talk about and focus on for the first chunk of this is Colorizers and Solarizers. So what is a colorizer? Well, back in the day, video was all black and white, like right up until, I don't know, whatever, the 60s or something. So people had, like 1 million episodes of sitcoms that were black and white, and then they would want to keep playing them on television. Since everything else on the television was in color at that point, they'd be like, if we want to do reruns of this, it's going to look like crap because everything else is color. So what people did was they developed these things that were, they would take grayscale information and usually chop it up into bands. You could chop it up into like 2, 4, 3, 7, 8, like, when I mean bands, I mean, so think about brightness as being on a scale from 0 to 1. So this is very bright, this is 1, and then this is very dark, this is 0. So if we divide that up into 4 bands, we're saying 0 to 25%, so that'd be all the darkness and maybe this kind of stuff, the really dark gray, will be one band, and then 25% to 50%, which would be this sort of like more ashy charcoal colors, would be another assigned to a different color. 50 to 75%, like this kind of stuff, would be assigned another color, and then the brightest stuff would get assigned a color. So it works a lot better than you would think, even with like very limited bands, because humans are really, really good at sort of like filling in the gaps. If you give someone like a black and white video, they're not going to be able to just put color into it without like a little bit of a key. But if you just sort of like tweak some things a little bit right and make sure people's like make sure that figures stand out from backgrounds and stuff and nothing looks too psychedelic, people will be able to sort of like add closure to that. And if you're interested in looking at it, look up like colorized I Love Lucy or colorized Tarzan or something. Just look up colorized old footage on YouTube and you can sort of see what I mean. If you really peer at it, it's going to obviously be like, oh, that's false. But if you just kind of like are watching it in the normal television state where you are in some sort of like an abstract, nearly comatose dream world, then the simple 4-band colorizer will work really well. But another thing to think about is that for video artists, when video artists were getting started in the 60s and 70s, most people didn't have access to full color anything. If you were doing video feedback, almost certainly you were doing video feedback with a black and white camera pointed at a black and white screen, meaning that people developed a lot of techniques for doing black and white feedback and then adding color to it afterwards. If you look at the Sandin video synthesizer, that massive modular setup, they used colorizers a lot. If you look at... I should come up with some more examples and do research for these things before I do them, because I don't have any other examples off the top of my head, but you can just know that a lot of the stuff made in the 70s was made in black and white and colorized afterwards. And I actually know a lot of people who work today, and they prefer to work in black and white and add color afterwards because there's just some things that are easier to do and to control in black and white. For example, what you can see is happening right here on the screen is this kind of pattern that's happening. This would be a little more difficult to do if it was in color because the color information would be doing a little bit of strobing. So I'm running it through a colorizer and I'm adding these kind of like outline things. And you know, if you add outlines, if you do any kind of outlining in feedback, that does tend to make things go a little spastic because outlining is sort of fundamentally going to like bump up the amount of like reaction diffusion things that happen. It can easily dissipate into just like a big noise field of blobs. But here I've got this really slow-paced black and white feedback thing going on. And I'm able to add these kind of like really crazy color outlines, and like it's not quite a gradient, but we can feel it as a gradient, if that makes sense. It's a little bit of a gradient. But yeah, so I've talked about colorizers. I think before I explain solarizers, we'll talk about colorizers, do some stuff with the colorizer first. And before I do any of that, I should talk about what sort of equipment I'm using today, so everyone has like a decent idea of what this setup is. So I'm using, I don't know if I can get this into my camera. It's so tiny on my screen, I can't tell. I think you can see, is that my video? Yes. So I've got a Sony broadcast camera, DV era, full-size DV, not even mini DV. Pointed at one of my favorite LCD TV screens. What the Sony is running through is I've got a Panasonic MX30, so I've got it running directly into the MX30, and I'm just stripping the color out of that, and that's all I'm doing with it right now. We might play around with some of the internal feedback later. Yeah, I mean, we definitely will play around with the internal feedback later. The output from this is running into the Vidicraft Vitamate enhancer, which is a video enhancer similar to the Archer, similar to the Avmod, where it's adding outlines, basically. I'm going to use this to help sort of control how much worms I get. This is sort of the secret. The secret to worms, as always, is sharpening things. You can sharpen things by upscaling, you can sharpen things by using LCD TVs that have a sharpen focus on them, you can sharpen things with an Archer video enhancer, or anything named a video enhancer. Yeah, sharpening. And I'm taking the output from that and running it into the Panasonic MX70, which I'm going to use primarily for, what do you call it? Just the YPBPR sort of manipulation. The playing around with the Y setup, for example, is how I'm doing this thing in particular. So I can sort of increase what's called the pedestal, which is just offsetting all of the brightness in sort of one swoop. And I can do that, which makes the blobs a lot stronger, and then you can see more of what's going on with the colorizer, all the bands, and then I can pull that right back down. So I've sort of caged myself in, so I can't really do too much hands-on with the camera in this situation. And then the output from the Panasonic is running into... So colorizers are kind of hard to find. There's not a lot on the market right now, and because there weren't really many sold as like devoted colorizer units in this sort of era of like late 80s, early 90s public access style like video gear that most of us like are working with here. Because there just was no demand, and you needed like if you're working with the color signal originally, you have to like do things like decode it to strip out the color and to mess around with the color, which is expensive. But yeah, so there is a colorizer Sintony Bastion over in France. Has sort of revived this really nifty little multi-band colorizer circuit that they found in a magazine, like an old magazine, called the FFG. It looks quite amazing. I think it has some Euro-Rack compatibility. You can buy that pre-made from Bastion. You can buy the kits, or you can look up the parts on their GitHub and build your own. I'm pretty sure we'll be offering some classes like that for this specific model this summer at Face Space, whenever everyone gets vaccinated and we can like hang out in the same room and whatnot. But yeah, the other colorizer I can think of that is available right now is one that I make. And this is another thing I kind of thought about for a while, which is that I do manufacture and sell video gear, and I try my best to sort of keep that away from the educational things I do, because I'm not interested in just sort of like being like, you want to learn something, why don't you learn how to give me money or whatever. But yeah, at the point where if there's nothing else out there, like that's why I make this stuff. And the colorizer, it's called Chromatic Aberration, which I've designed. And I've got another little nifty updated version that I'm working with and testing tonight that I'll be posting on GitHub and posting for people who want to DIY it. So I'm not that compromised about talking about my gear on here, because if it's one of the only things out there that does this thing, and if people can sort of like DIY it, then I mean, there's options. That makes a lot more options than trying to like scrape for like some very specific kind of hardware that was only made in the 70s or whatever, or 60s. Yeah, so let's talk about Chromatic Aberration. Chromatic Aberration, I'm using this with my sort of capture bundle setup, which is just like the recommended hardware setup for, what do you call it, analog or HDMI inputs. And I've got the output from the MX70 running into Chromatic Aberration. And what Chromatic Aberration doing is just sort of throwing away the color information it gets, and then I'm using the sliders on here that allow me to do things like turn up or down the saturation for each band, and then change the color for each band. For example, I just pulled out all of the saturation out of the 1/2/3 band, the 50% to 75%. And if I pull it all out of the top one, we can see that almost all the color is up here above 50. As I change these two, we can sort of see how we can like, oh, let me turn the saturation back up on this one. And if we don't want full saturation, we can do just set it to like midway. And that'll do some more subtle things with the blending. You can see I can just control and dial in whatever color I want. And because I'm a nut for modulation, as you may have seen in some of my other videos about things, I made sure that you can modulate everything in here. So I've added these sort of frame-based audio-style LFOs in here at the moment to do, what do you call it? Sort of like move through the colors in like a really smooth way. So yeah, we'll just kind of like leave this as is for the moment, and then maybe go and play with the feedback for a second. Editing. So a couple of things to think about when you're working in this sort of like black and white mono feedback. there's a lot that you can do with sort of like controlling grayscale things that'll make the colorizer sort of like give the colorizer a bit more to play with. So you can see when I was messing around with earlier, the setup I had was just sort of sticking with the above 50. But as I'm going to mess around with the zoom and the focus here, we can get some more, a bit more going on in terms of gradients. Sharpen this up a bit more. When I said sharpen there, I was referring mainly to the lens. Using the focus on the lens can be very much the same thing as doing blur and sharpen. Someone asked about camera feedback techniques for blurring and sharpening things, and this is kind of where we're at. Like, what you can do is sort of like for example, I've got, oh, this is a really interesting little like mountain range thing I've got happening here. But I can blur, so what I'm doing is sort of defocusing the lens a bit, and then sharpening via the little video, Vidicraft Vitamate thing. So this is sort of, as far as I can tell, about the best I can do at the moment that sort of does a similar thing to like the blur and sharpen modes, say in like video waves, or if you just take an image in any kind of a photo editing thing and just repeatedly blur and sharpen it over and over again, you'll get reaction diffusion patterns, because in those programs, blur and sharpen are convolutional processes, which are essentially, when you iterate them, will become like cellular automata style game of life video feedback situations. But yeah, so we've got some really simple things we can just do here with like filling the screen with some worms. I'm not getting a lot of gradients happening, but sort of try to mess around with some color settings. Another thing that I find works really, really well with the black and white feedback is you'll get way different effects when you do the inverted. So what I did was I just inverted, I turned it into black and white grayscale on the MX50, and now we'll play around with the camera a little bit more. You can see it's going to get pretty detailed. Some blurry stuff happening here. Defocus the heck up. Another thing I'm using the MX74 is using the decay on it. We'll try some more of these effects in a bit. But yeah, doing the inverted feedback with this can really give you a lot of control over the image. Because if you just bypass this right now, you can see what's going on. Like, this is just what the camera is doing right now. So in the feedback loop, it's sort of a more simple thing to control. Like, a lot of times when you do inverted feedback and you have the color on, I just turned it on and you can't see it being on in Chromatic Aberration. You can't see the color being on, but you can see how there's like another level of strobing things happening, correct? And if I turn it back to mono, we get a more controlled thing. So this is essentially what people are talking about when they say, I find black and white feedback easier to handle. It's that once you toss out that channel of color and you're just interested in compositing a grayscale image, you do actually get like, you get more control, and it can be easier to be like intentional, especially about these kind of like slow shifting patterns. Let's bring the color back in. So you can see with this too, I've got more of the sort of like 25 to 50% band in here. That's the red right now. And I'm bringing in 50% to 75%. I'm going to keep that not at full saturation, but then I am going to fully saturate the top channel. The reason I like full saturation on that sort of extreme top channel is that it gives this sort of like vivid outlining thing happening. And it makes it also sort of, full saturation things feel less bright to us, if that makes sense. You think about brightness, and we can tell that color is bright when we see it. But the thing is that like colors with the same sort of brightness value will appear less bright to us, and colors that have like if you take the top range and map it to like blue at full saturation, it's gonna feel kind of weird because you look at it and you say, huh, I feel like that should be brighter than it is. Like it should have more green in it, or it should have less saturation. So I find it to be a really nice trick to do this kind of less saturation in the middle, but a lot of saturation right at the top and at the bottom. And it can kind of make for these weird, vivid things happening. But yeah, there's really no way I could get this kind of a color scheme and patterns happening if the colorizer was in the feedback loop. And we will try a little bit of stuff with the colorizer in the feedback loop afterwards, so I can show you what the difference is. It can actually be pretty cool, but it's like a lot to control. Also do a little bit of the downstream key on here. That'll be pretty wacky. So this, I'm doing downstream key not on the feedback. Like I've got an internal feedback channel on here, but I've got this video feedback channel. And something which is interesting, which you can do on these MXs that are the Panasonics, MXs or AVs, if they have this sort of downstream key control, which pretty much most of them do, is you can use that along with the strobe, and you can get this really interesting kind of topographical sort of like thing happening. Because what the downstream key is like outlining the brightest part, and if you do it while you've got the black, or while you've got not black and white, but you've got black and white inverted, you're gonna get this kind of like really crazy stuff. Let me try focusing the camera a little bit more. This also works really well if you have a camera that has auto exposure. This camera does not. It's got fixed exposure. I could probably turn it on, but I don't like to because I really want to be able to control the exposure on this. If you play around with this in auto exposure, maybe that's another sort of, that's probably another good episode to focus on, would be just sort of like unique things about certain cameras. That could get a little like gear focused, but maybe I'll just focus on like really nifty things you can do with security cameras, which are usually cheap as heck. Because I feel like I overlooked security cameras for a long time, but they're kind of, I think, the best option for a lot of folks out there. And yeah, you should definitely look into security cams on eBay or wherever, the local junk shops you go to. This is pretty crazy. Enough of that downstream key for the moment. Yeah, very specifically wanted to have the MX70 going right before the Colorizer, because this allows me to like directly mess around with the brightness, add more contrast, add less contrast, change the ranges entirely. Kind of cheating, but I mean, it's not really cheating, it's just knowing how to use the things, I guess. One more oscillation here. Let me oscillate the second band. That faster. Alright. So I wanted to have the MX70 involved because it'll let me mess around with a lot more of the effects on there too. For example, we can do some pixelation. Pixelate it, but also kind of blend it with the original signal. Can we? Yeah, there it is. Blend it with an inverted version of the same. Didn't like that. Interesting. Why are you doing that? Oh, defocus was on. Oh, that's pretty experimental. You know, that's the thing about experiments. Experiments don't always pan out. This is kind of one of my favorite modes on this MX70 is you can do the sort of individual X and Y pixelation, and then with the inverted feedback you've got these weird little like pixel oscillator things. I can change this to X instead. That's the internal feedback. Back to camera feedback. Yeah, camera feedback, it's sort of amazing once you start digging around with FX, how you can use camera feedback for a lot of patterns. Like, I don't think you'd like immediately think of this as being camera feedback if I hadn't just like told you what it was. I mean, you probably also would be somewhat confused as to what the hell is actually going on in here. Yeah, pretty cool. Alright, so I took just a little break there to try to set up something a little bit different with the camera. Specifically what I wanted to do was rig up something where I could do some more rotational things. So the nice thing about using tripods is that you can control things pretty easily. But unfortunately, unless you have like a gimbal head or some sort of very specific piece of hardware for doing like full 360-degree rotations, it can be hard to do this sort of like really fun rotational stuff. And I've personally done this kind of stuff a lot more with colorizers. So I'm rigging up, I used to never use, what do you call it, tripods for years when doing video feedback. All I ever did was just fucking stack up like a bunch of books and VHS tapes like I'm doing right now, and then maybe I like add a couple of tarot cards on there, and I just use that. And then if you do that, it's a really cheap and easy way to sort of do this more rotational feedback kind of stuff, which is a lot of fun. Specifically what I wanted it in here for was because it allows for these kind of like banding things to happen, so you can see a lot more of, I'm losing some of the grayscale here, but we're getting these like really nice pattern bands between black and white, which I think is pretty awesome. And this will work really well when I start to talk about what a solarizer does. Yeah, you can also set things up like this, and then we turn off the inversion. Oops, too bright. Yeah, let me see if I can get one of these going on. Yes, I can. Some cellular birth mode, dancing worms. I don't know, I don't actually have like a great name for this mode yet. If you have a good name for this specific mode, you get that giant ball sort of like curling out, let me know. Got a lot of light pollution down here today too, because, you know, we have to have lighting so you can see my face. You can see my incredibly overexposed forehead. Of course, the thing about doing rotational feedback like this is you've got to kind of stand there and hold things. And if you want it to stay, you've got to give it a nice platform and like wedge some tarot cards under one side or whatever. But yeah, I mean, if you're just creative enough, you can figure out some things that'll work pretty well. I mean, other things you can do is rotate the screen. I did one project where I just took the screen and I flipped it like upside down. Rotating is fun. Spirals are nice. Crazy blobby patterns are really fun. Oh yeah, there, that's what I was looking for. Oop, I'm gonna lose it, I'm gonna lose it. Come on, you got it. Ah, lost it. Of course, it's pretty easy to like lose where you are on the screen when you do this kind of a thing. Yeah, so let me set this at like a fun angle. Is that gonna work? Really? That's a nice little rotational thing, and I need to move this up. The thing about rotational feedback too is that it can get really confusing to think about what does position mean. So just lift that up enough. Got some more VHSs around, right? So it's good to always have a big pile of VHSs, like mint in box, Fuji HQ 160. Or this one, Bollywood hits. Bollywood hits are great, by the way. If you're not into Bollywood music, that stuff is great. Yeah, this will just be good enough. Welcome to another episode of watching Andre noodle around with things and not really get a satisfying conclusion from what they were trying to do. This is pretty satisfying. What happens if I turn off invert? Yeah, that's pretty great too. Another thing I can do on here, I can turn on, so this MX70 also allows me to like artificially defocus things, which can get a little bit, it can kill the feedback pretty quickly. Okay, so this is the problem, this is why people oftentimes don't really like this rotational feedback is you can get some patterns which have unpleasant connotations, especially if you do this pi over 2 feedback, but then you do this, which is wow. Alright, so let's talk about solarizers now. So what a solarizer means, well, I guess very specifically what a solarizer means in this unit means that it's remapping, it's taking those 4 bands, so we're dividing the brightness up into 4 bands, and we add color based on brightness. But what we can also do while we're messing around with this sort of individual band stuff is you can solarize. And this is just kind of a term for just you can grab each band and then remap the brightness on it. So that means we can kind of see what's going on. I had the darkest color, the 0 to 25%, with saturation all the way up mapped to something. If I turn the saturation down, we're just going to have this really sort of alien black background, or white background, which is super rad. And also map this to sort of a perceptibly lighter color, and that'll make things sort of pop out more. Oh, that's not how I map the color. There we go. So this is pretty bonkers right off the bat. We've mapped the darkest band up to be super bright and added another super bright color to it. And I'm going to mess around with the second band here. I can see somewhere in this chain we've got some noise. Noisy chains. That's what happens when you bring up the darkness. And while we're oscillating things, I'm just kind of like doing... I'm not really solarizing, I'm just remapping things. The reason I call it a solarizer is it sounds clever, and you can solarize with this. I mean, there's not a lot of video things out there that have solarizing on it. Videonics MX1 and the V4 original has solarized. Those are the ones that I know of. And now I can also turn up the, what do you call it? Turned on all the oscillators. I turned the oscillators on the brightness, so now they're going to cycle through the whole brightness spectrum, each one of these bands, which is how we're going to get these kind of really nifty outline things happening. Alright, now let me play around with this feedback some more. Let's get out of swastika zones. We can do some more casual sorts of... So this one... Whoa! Sorry! Sorry, tape. I mean, I guess I don't have to apologize to a tape. I just turned off the video camera, though. I mean, it's okay to apologize to the tape. I think the tape knows it was my fault. Well, it wasn't completely my fault. It knows it was not intentional. Some really, really tiny sorts of rotational things here. Spiral going on. While I'm at it, let me turn the color back on here, because that'll give me a little bit more gradient to work with. Yeah, we're doing some really nice sort of outliney things happening in the output here. And that's sort of... It's like one of my favorite things you can do with this feedback is sort of grab the outlines and make those like pop out. Because sometimes when you're doing the feedback, the screen itself, things can get sort of a little blurry or muddy, and you don't get to really like see like exactly what's happening with all the really complex patterns. But being able to modulate and remap all these bands is sort of like gives you like it lets you see things that you wouldn't necessarily see otherwise. Trying to get into mega blob mode here. Blobs. And you do this kind of stuff, which, I mean, it might not look, it doesn't really look that remarkable on the screen, like the feedback that I'm doing, but it looks a lot crazier being processed. Of course, there's some other things I can do with the setup too. Go into the MX70 and page here. So, some mirrors. Mirrors. There we go. Some ridiculous symmetry. That's my hand. Another thing I don't know if I mentioned, I probably mentioned it in like every single one of these, but do physical things in the feedback loop. Get your hand in there. Get your body in there. Put like a weird like shaped thing or like some glass or just anything that's like mildly diffuse. Put a roll of toilet paper in there. Am I in the frame? Okay, just barely. But yeah, try some things out with that. There's a lot you can do in there. It's pretty fun. This is an interesting mode. Symmetry brain. How many faces are people seeing in this feedback right now? Let me know in the comments. How many skulls? How many faces? How many alien entities? How many DMT elves? Let's turn this into a landscape instead of a face. Now we've got a waterfall happening. Alright, so next up I'm going to set up a feedback loop with the colorizer in there. So stay tuned. Okie dokie. So I got things set up now, so the camera feedback loop is now viewing the output from the colorizer. So I can show you some of the difficulties. My sweater's on backwards. Doesn't matter to anybody watching. Unless you get frustrated by me just doing this every like 10 seconds or so. Should also make sure to stop chewing my food before I do a take. But yeah, so now we've got a closed loop here with the camera viewing the output from the colorizer, so I can show you there are things you can do with the colorizer in the loop, but there are some things that will get kind of tricky. So yeah, let's just talk about that. So I'm going to turn up the lowest band, and because the lowest band is very dark, you don't really see anything happening. We turn up saturation on the second lowest band. So now we see it's starting to creep in. We got that blue creeping in there. But because it's still so dark, the camera is pretty okay, and I've got the camera running color out too. So you can sort of, I'll show you what you can do by turning the camera output to mono in a second. But the camera is going to perceive, so when you remap brightness, or you remap the color, you can't really do that without changing the perceived brightness as well. I think I talked about this a little bit earlier, but we perceive brightness and the camera perceives brightness in some similar sorts of ways, and we'll see how that can kind of mess things up. As we change color, we notice that it's still kind of dark enough that we're not getting any changes in the feedback at all. It's just doing exactly what it's doing. I'm going to turn up the saturation on the third band. to see a bit more changes going on. So the more difference there is between the two bands, the more strobing we're gonna see. Let me turn off some of the delay as well. The delay is stabilizing things. Let me turn the delay off entirely so you can see what happens without a delay stabilizing, and things are starting to sort of speed up and flip around a bit. I'll turn the delay, decay, delay. They're kind of the same thing back on, but leave it a little more subtle so we'll see a bit more of what this colorizer is doing to things. Yeah, as we sort of change the relationship between these two colors and make them like radically different brightnesses, perceived brightnesses, then we get some things happening. And finally, here's where it's going to get really messy. I'm going to dial up the saturation on the brightest band, and that's where things are going to start to kind of get more extreme. So if we do it too much, and the colors are just the same between things, then it's just going to like stop. So these two colors are basically the same. We don't really get any feedback happening. But as we make them sort of more different, then we're going to get some more noisy strobing happening. And as I turn the saturation up all the way, it kind of kills a lot of it. But we get this really interesting effect happening here. Alright, so now we got all these things going on. Let's try oscillating the colors. Try to keep the oscillations slow. I'm going to dial down the saturation on the brightest channel. So I feel like we'll get better feedback if there's less things moving around up there. Set these things to oscillate. Make sure nothing's oscillating at the same frequency. Play around with some stuff. Here's score what you can do with the colorizer in the loop. Let's turn off the inversion while we're at it too. See what happens. Oh yeah, we're gonna get brain blob mode for sure. And we need to turn up the brightness a lot on the camera, let more light in. I want to sharpen some things up by focusing. And yeah, we're gonna get this kind of brain blob thing happening. Just everything sort of stops. And this is kind of the tricky thing about working with colorizers in the feedback loop, is it's just so easy to kind of kill the feedback. You know what I'm talking about. Where it's just kind of going to do this really slow blobbing thing. And yeah, donezo. Another thing you can do if you're working with colorizers and you want to keep them in the feedback loop is you can turn, a lot of mixers will allow you to sort of go monocolor. Some cameras will let you do that too. And if you just have a black and white camera, then it won't even like mess around with the color. Off. Oh, donezo. Yeah, and if you think it's sensitive, ooh, we got one little blob, it's still alive. Can I get the brain blobs mode happening? You can do a little blob. Don't go away. There we go. Brain blobs. Game the system. There we go. That's what I needed to do. I'm adding some more of the pedestal. Yeah, finicky as all heck. I haven't even turned on the Solarizer yet. Here, let me turn on the Solarizer stuff. Okay, this is pretty amazing, actually. But like a lot of the more amazing feedback patches, it's a little tricky to do reliably. What I did was I turned on solarizing function where I turned up the lowest band a lot. So now we've got almost maximum for the lowest band. And we'll leave the middle channels where they are. Let me take the top band and make that dark. There we go. So we're getting some strobing happening. A lot of that strobing is coming from as the colors are cycling because all the colors are oscillating. You notice when the colors get too close together, then we kind of like, it causes like a sort of phase shift. And then as the colors differentiate again, we get more contrast happening. We get that going on. This is pretty fun though. As always, the most important lessons these should teach is that once you get started doing video feedback in a session or in life, it's really hard to stop because there's always just one more thing you can try, and you learn new things about it every time you experiment. Yeah, what a fun world. Let me turn on the oscillation. I'm going to turn the oscillation on the solarizing bands now. So I turn up more delay. Oh, it's already turned all the way up. What if I turn it down? We're going to start to get a little bit more strobing. Those outlines look really nice though. Opposing outlines, lots of fun. Since we're solarizing things on those two bands, let's see what happens when we add a little bit of saturation to them. And here we are. Classic noisy blobby things. Exactly what I said what would happen. Trying to play around with inverting the feedback now, but like the mixer and the feedback just doesn't even know what to do with that much sort of color. That's sort of the color craziness happening. I can do some rotational stuff while I got this set up too. Let's rotate some shit. I know when I whisper things, you can't actually hear them. But if I whisper something, it's not actually worth listening to. Alright, so I think I need to eat dinner soon, so that means I probably need to finish up this episode. I said I'd do more things in it. Turns out I didn't, and I got really distracted by this, but that just means I can have more stuff for the next one. Let me try playing around with the strobe a little bit. Yeah. That's pretty amazing. Some pretty crazy dancing happening here. If you're watching this when it first came out, also, go check out my website and you'll find out a lot more information about not just other things, other sorts of things I make, other tutorials I have, written word information, but on Valentine's Day this year, we're going to be doing at Phase Space and some of our friends, we're going to be doing some live stream AV stuff, performances, games, whatnot. Instead of live streaming on Twitch, what we're going to do is use a Zoom room. So it'll be a Zoom party. I bet everyone is just sick to death of Zoom parties at this point in their life. If you're watching this in the future, this is recorded about 1 year into coronavirus quarantine mode. But, you know, I did one of these things for New Year's Eve, and it was actually a lot of fun. Yeah, I think if you're interested in seeing some live video feedback stuff and some crazy music and playing some ridiculous games, yeah, stop by my website. I've got links and information on how to check that out. You just basically log into Zoom. That's all it takes. But yeah, I liked that it allowed for this sort of video, like a video chat with a large number of people, which sort of actually gave the feeling of being with a large number of people and getting to see like live music and stuff. It felt more like a show than anything else I've done for live streaming in this entire time. And I've tried a lot of things for live streaming. So yeah, come check that out. Valentine's Day. It's going to be romantic. Alrighty, I'm super hungry now, so I gotta say farewell. Thanks a bunch for watching. Oh yeah, I just noticed I was adding a link to something today, and I saw that the first video of this series had like 2,000 views. So thanks everybody who's watching and sharing and getting fun stuff out of this. I'm guessing 2,000 people aren't probably going to make it all the way to this point. Through like 16 hours or whatever of me like rambling and making mistakes, but that'd be pretty funny if it was. Okay, cool. Thanks a bunch, and as always, have fun.